Welcome to the Unfolding Thought Podcast. My name is Eric Pradum. Today, I speak with Carlos Martinez, Site Director at MilliporeSigma, a leader in the life sciences industry. Carlos shares his unique perspective on connecting science, leadership, and personal strengths to lead and build cohesive teams that find true meaning and personal growth in their work. In our conversation, we explore Carlos's journey from Puerto Rico to a global career, his thoughts on bridging differences to create innovation, and how tools like CliftonStrengths have shaped his approach to management and mentorship. And now, I bring you Carlos Martinez. Carlos, thank you for joining me. Would you mind giving us a little bit of your background?
Good morning, Eric. I like to think, right, that my humble beginnings back in the island of Puerto Rico, that's where I was born, did have an impact on what I have become today. I am one of 6 in my household. I'm the oldest, so I taught my parents how to be parents. I lived in the island of Puerto Rico through my 21st birthday, and then moved to Texas to finish my graduate school. So my bachelor's degree is in chemistry. It's a bachelor's degree in science with a focus on chemistry. And then I came to Texas, specifically to Texas A&M, for a PhD. So I finished a PhD, a doctorate degree in organic chemistry. So it's kind of weird, but it's very technical field. I had the opportunity at that time to work with 2 incredible scientists, ultimately, who supported me on my final PhD dissertation. One was in organic chemistry. The other person was in molecular biology and genetics, where I kind of combined these 2 life science and physical sciences together. And I hope that this is kind of bringing a little bit of a theme here already. I love bridging, and that is one of the things that I like about the way I'm wired. Is I love bringing 2 different things together to hopefully produce something super incredibly powerful. At the time that I was finishing my PhD was also the time of the now famous Human Genome Project. Right. So I was finishing my PhD and subsequently did my 1-year postdoctoral appointments with a gentleman named Richard Gibbs, who was the head essentially of one of the institutions or labs that were awarded money by the United States government to help sequencing the human genome. So I was right smack in the middle of that whole race to finish. So them, along with 3 or 4 others, right, were granted money by the government to actually do this. When Craig Venter came as a private entity and then started to race down that path, it was super fascinating just to see the discord and the competition going on in science, right, in this whole thing. It was beautiful to see. It was a part of it. After which, I joined the forces of what at the time was called Sigma Aldrich, based out of St. Louis, in your neck of the woods. So that was back in the year 2000. And since I've been a part of this company, which now is part or is essentially Merck of Darmstadt, Germany. It says KGaA. It's called Merck. Everywhere in the world, with the exception of the United States and Canada, where legally we go by our business unit names, MilliporeSigma and so on. So I guess what I would say is curious about this is about halfway in my degree, I realized that I really didn't want to spend another minute in the lab. I wanted to find a job where I was given the opportunity to work to put together a team. And that's how I ended up with Sigma Aldrich. I had opportunities to go work pharmaceuticals and other places. Ultimately, this is the place that said, hey, we need to put together a team and you're going to be it, right? It wasn't the most incredible offer at the time, but it was the offer that gave me the chance, the opportunity to do what I really wanted to do, which is a lesson for me in life, and perhaps a lesson that people that may listen to this may also want to take away, right? Your opportunities may never just be the ones that look the brightest, but they are nevertheless opportunities, and sometimes you just have to give it a chance. So that's a little bit of that. In my more personal aspect of it, I am a father of two, a proud husband of one for the last 29 years. And that is the other part that I spend most of my time on, right? It's either working and helping some people along their leadership journeys or trying to lead within my family. And that's, as you may know, even harder than it is to do so at work. So that's a little bit of myself. Maybe one more thing, and that is that I told you that about 3 years into my PhD, I knew I didn't want to spend another minute in the bench, and that was because I really enjoy helping people find what is unique about themselves. And along the way, about 10 years ago from today, which would have been in 2014, my wife introduced me to CliftonStrengths. At the time was Strengths Finder. She said, you should take this. You're going to love it. And indeed, I took it. I fell in love with the tool, so much so that a few years, not too long after that, I went to Gallup and got certified as a Gallup Strengths Coach, which I have been for the last 10 years. And I have basically used that to help me become a better leader rather than actually going out and doing coaching on my own. It has been more about how can I use this to help others find their aha. And that's what motivates me every day. Whenever I see the eyes of someone shine because I have noticed something and I mention it to them just at the right time and with enough color, and they go, you know what? I've never thought about it that way. You just walk away. You just know at some point that person is going to do something great, even if you never know it, right? And that is enough for me for another day. It's like making a birdie on an 18-hole course, but then bogeying and then terrible on the other 17. I still will go back to that golf course just because I made that one birdie, right? So that's the way I look at things, Eric. And a little bit about what motivates me, maybe, and a little bit about my past.
Thank you, Carlos. I appreciate that. There are so many things that you mentioned that I want to hit on. I doubt we're going to have enough time. That's okay, actually. I suppose one thing that I'll say is I really appreciate you bringing up, when you're talking about your background, things at home, because, we can separate personal and professional life, and we can debate how much is managing or mentoring like parenting and how much is it not. But at least as far as I view my professional life, I view my development as a person, I feel a lot of, or see a lot of similarities between the maturation or whatever I might call it that I go through in work and then the maturation or the journey that I'm taking as a parent or as a spouse. So I appreciate you bringing that up. I don't know if we should camp here for very long, but because you mentioned Puerto Rico and then moving to Texas, I'm curious. So you grew up in Puerto Rico, you started your studies there, you started down the educational journey, the science path. In terms of culture, in terms of the way that maybe your fellow students approached one another or approached their studies, did you experience or do you remember
any substantial differences between the way that people were, or the way that school was run, or anything like that in Puerto Rico versus Texas?
Absolutely. And I do think, culture is a big thing these days, right? You talk about culture at work, pretty much anywhere you go. And specifically, the culture in Puerto Rico was greatly influenced by Spain, right? So Puerto Rico being discovered or colonized by Spain did bring all of that with it. In addition to that, very similar to the United States, our history also has spots of things such as slavery and other pieces, which, though not the good thing to remember, is part of history. And what that brought was a mixture of peoples, right? At the end, if you go to Puerto Rico, and it's something I tell people, Puerto Ricans are considered a minority within the terms of the United States, right? Where there is a label for something, for everything. But if you go to Puerto Rico, you're just a Puerto Rican, right? It doesn't matter whether what scale in the color spectrum you are. So that is fairly unique. So when I moved for my PhD to the United States, there were a few things that were very different. Apart from the language, I had already started to study. We study both languages. Not everybody's very good at English, but we are exposed. So apart from the fact that I needed to get my brain sort of readjusted to a new language on a day-to-day basis, there were other things which I want to point out that actually translate also to the studying, which is there is a certain amount of warmth that the Latin culture has. It's very family-oriented. People, especially in Puerto Rico, it's a small island, about 100 miles by 35. It doesn't really matter where you are less than 17 miles away from the sea. There is that family orientation, and that translates to friendships, right? And you don't have or can't go too far without bumping into someone that you already know. So when you go to school, it is a very similar thing, right? You will find someone you know. And as you establish those relationships, they carry on to the study, the getting together. In those cases, however, I don't think that that's much different between the two, except that the biggest difference for me is there is a certain amount of individualism in the United States that isn't in Puerto Rico, right? Like you live a bit more alone. It translates to families too. The more families I got to know, and I say, hey, when was the last time you talked to your brother? I said, I don't know, it was years. I go, years? Are you crazy? I call my family every week. And to this day, right? I've been in the United States, in the continental United States, since 1995, right? And I don't miss it. I don't miss calling. I need to establish and continue that connection. So going back to school, it's just a different approach. It's just a little bit of a familiar or family approach to almost everything you do. And in my field, in chemistry, I did undergrad research. I was privileged enough to have a scholarship from the NIH, and then also from what at the time was called Eastman Kodak. I don't know, from the days of the picture stuff. They had this huge campus up north in New York, and I had the opportunity to be funded through my bachelor's degree and then go and work there. I have plenty of experiences to share, but ultimately the key there was that I went there with a bunch of other folks from there, and we lived essentially very close to each other in Rochester. And the same warmth we try to keep in there, because you're in a place where you're not familiar with, and all you have is the people that you know, and you stick with them, and you build upon that in terms of confidence and protection. So to answer your question, or come back and answer your question, yes, there were differences, mainly I think along the lines of culture, which are just embedded more in a macro level, right? Not everybody. There are certainly people in Puerto Rico that love to be alone and don't want to be touched, right? But I say in general, you will see more family orientation. You see people remaining in touch, and that translates into studying in universities. Things that are similar. Kids like myself, as they got to high school, they were going to college, they wanted to be out of the house, right? And we wanted to be in an apartment, even though that apartment was less than an hour away from the house. And that sort of created that level of independence that every one of us seeks as we grow up. So those are for sure similar, the pressures of school and all of that. For me, however, as I moved into the United States, to Texas A&M, the distance was difficult. Just the fact that on the weekends, I couldn't just hop in the car and drive home and have a warm meal from my mom was difficult. But it was difficult for about a year. And then after that, this became my life. And I thrived, and I love my independence. So the part that I love about is there's enough space for you to be alone if you want to, and together if you want to. And nobody will tell you anything about it.
Thank you. Some of what you described there actually leads to something I wanted to ask you about from your background. So I'm not going to get your wording correct, but you said something like you like to take two different things or two different ideas and put them together and see if you can make something bigger, better, something new. And as you were saying that, you reminded me of the story, or maybe I can describe it as an argument that was made for why it was that of all the people that were searching for the structure of DNA, why was it Watson and Crick that are credited with that? And I forget what book this was in, but the person who I was reading made this argument that you had a lot of scientists that were molecular biologists, or they were zoologists, or whatever it was that was their specialty. And mostly they were, some leading scientist who maybe had some postdoc students with them, or some PhD candidates, or whatever it was, working in their lab. But it was kind of just one person within one specialty that was leading these experiments to try and find the structure of DNA. And then in this sort of binary, I guess, that is set up in this story, you had Watson and Crick, and I think one of them was a molecular biologist and the other one was a zoologist or something like that. And so similar, but still slightly different fields. And they were both apparently looking for the structure of DNA, but what they would often do is apparently they would go on walks together and they would talk about the experiments that they were doing and the way that they saw things. And when you talk to someone who has a different perspective, and you can be open and you can be challenged, and, I can keep going, but you have the opportunity to have the person that you're talking to say, I think I also heard you say this effectively. Oh, I never thought of that. Or now that you say this, so Carlos, you did an experiment, or you experienced a thing in work and you describe it in this way. And I perhaps say back to you, I don't see it like that. I see it like this. It's like an iron sharpens iron sort of scenario. And again, the argument that was made in this book that I was reading was that, you can, like you were saying, more or less take two different things and use them to make something better, bigger, new, or whatever it is. And so now, after that very long preamble, what I wanted to come back around to is am I reaching when I think that with the way that you described a perhaps tighter knit community, or more, being closer to your family at a bare minimum physically, if not also, emotionally, let's say, and having a warmth in the culture or relations with people in Puerto Rico that you experience, either you didn't experience quite as much in Texas, or it's just different. Do you think that that might have contributed to your upbringing, that Puerto Rican culture. Do you think that might have contributed to your desire to take two things and put them together? Chocolate and peanut butter might be better together, and or to want to build a team and not be that solo scientist. And I'm using air quotes here.
That is a very interesting question, and sort of brings a little bit of that nature question as well. How much influence do these things actually have in who we are? So I personally believe that there are some things that are just innate, and it really does not matter where you're born or who you're surrounded by. These things are about a lot of that having to do with genetics, just simply it's what came with the package, right? But that the experiences that you have through culture, through where you live, through where your parents brought you to, whether you travel or you didn't, whether you had a big family or a small family, basically bring out a lot of what is already in through the means of practice, right? It's just simply you experience it, and then there is a reaction to that experience that tells you either I want to do more of this, or I don't want nothing to do with this anymore, right? A little bit influenced by that pre-wiring. But of course, if you're not experiencing those, you may miss on the opportunity to do that. And then later on in life, you may experience that years and years later, not in the same group, not with the same people. And you go, whoa, where was all this time? But it was always there. It just never had the opportunity to sprout. However, that influence, right, that you had, I do remember, and oftentimes you have to do these exercises where you go back and say, where was that first time that you saw that you had this intense desire, right, to identifying other people, what makes them great. And it's hard, right, because our memories get a little blurry over time. But I can tell you that for my first through ninth grade, where I was pretty much in the nucleus of my family every day, very protected. First kid, I told you, right? I taught my parents how to be parents, and they were just hugely protective. This may sound crazy, but when I got to ninth and going to high school, I had an aunt, which I adore, who said, no. Carlos needs to go to the high school I was not zoned for. Okay. This is the high school in the downtown of my little town, as opposed to a new high school that was just next door, where I would have just basically had the same people, be surrounded by the same people. So if you have someone who actually created such a hiccup in my lifeline, right? That was that aunt. And she found a way, she brought me in there. That's the time that I came out of my cocoon, right? All of a sudden, I started to see the possibilities, who I was. I had done so in church. I could probably sense some things, and there's some fire that was out there that just wasn't lit up yet. It was just a little spark. And then I met these folks that were at the time, they were in the downtown area. They had lots of relationships, right? And it fascinated me how quickly and how easy they form relationships. Through my relationship with them, by meeting them, right, I started to meet some of the same people. And I started to go, wow, this is incredible, right? I was not by definition the most popular person, as in, the quarterback or the captain of the team or whatever. But I was intelligent, so I was participating of things that were visible. And I'll come to where all these things come together. But all of a sudden, I was in the eye of the people around me. And to this day, my mom calls me every once in a while and says, I just ran into so-and-so. He was, or she was with you in high school, and they say hello. I said, who is this person, right? But when you are on stage, a lot of people will know you. and will remember you, especially if some way, somehow you did something, said something. And this is sort of that influencing or that denting that I love to think I'm doing in the world, is that you will say something or you will do something that will affect someone in some way. And that connection between what you say or what you did and what that person experienced and then did as a result of is a bridge. It's an invisible one, but it will be there. And at some point they will remember you. And then you go, okay, I'm glad that I said that. But at that moment, you were not that. Going back to how this whole thing of bridging happens is, I remember distinctively at that moment in my life, 10th grade, was the time where I thought, okay, I really enjoy this. Really, I just absolutely love that, and it continued to evolve until I got to college. And in college, it really just took off, right? And I started to get involved in undergrad research, and I met even more people, and now I knew professors, and then you start seeing the value of those relationships, strategically speaking. We're talking about that earlier before we started recording, that there is this way of being strategic. And in my case, it's far more about the relationship building, and that's the way I'm strategic, than it is about spending a lot of time away thinking about how I'm going to do that, right? It just happens. It's just about observation. It's about just simply seeing something in someone and be able to articulate what that was at that very precise moment, sparking a specific conversation that then eventually just grows into something amazing. If not, just simply drives that person to go and do something amazing, right? And you may never see it, you may never know it, but when it does happen, and if you ever find about it, is the moment, right? It's the teacher moment when the student comes back and says, hey, Mr. Martinez, how are you? Do you remember me? That is, I don't look for that moment when they come back. I just look for the moment when I can say something that I believe will have at least the effect of sparking something. Curiosity about the self, curious about what they did, or just simply highlighting what they did so they can repeat it. That's what I live for, right? That's what I live for.
One of the things you were just saying a minute ago reminded me, one description of culture is that it's a process of social learning. So social meaning essentially a group of people, right? And so if the group is learning something, you can imagine a scenario in which a person identifies, hey, in this type of situation, the best tool to use is a hammer or words, or I don't know what, without getting too specific into a made up scenario, an individual identifies, they do an experiment basically. And we're all doing experiments when 50,000 years ago, or go way into the past, lightning strikes, or we have bad weather, or whatever. We do an experiment. Am I safer? Do I stay drier if I am under a tree versus in a cave versus whatever? An individual finds a solution, and then that gets passed on until such time as this is just what we do, and people forget why they do the thing that way. Where did it come from? What's the ultimate reason? And they may not even really know what they get out of that custom that has been passed down. It's just what we do. You mentioned earlier as well, I think when you were giving your background, that you like to tell someone, well, here's what I think about that, or here's how I see the situation, or have you ever thought about it in this way? And then sort of just walk away. And you reminded me of when you said that. There's a quote from Blaise Pascal that goes something like, a man will always be more convinced by ideas that have come into his own mind than by those which have come into the mind of others. And I know that's not the exact quote, but the idea is, if I do that experiment and I say, hey, when it's raining, I'm going to stay dry. if I, build this sort of lean-to structure. I came up with the idea, but when it starts to rain and Carlos, you say, hey, Eric, you need to go build a lean-to in particular because I'm high in self-confidence, as we talked about before we started recording, and we'll probably come around to that. I'm probably going to go, yeah, whatever. Carlos is smart and all, but I have a lot of good ideas. But if I come up with the idea myself, I'm going to be quite convinced. And so what I'm trying to stitch together here is I really like that you have an appreciation for, we have sort of cultural standards, or we have a way that we do things. And yet, despite the fact that this is just the way we do things, things just get passed down to us, you also have an appreciation for the fact that sometimes you need to ask a question or give your opinion, but your opinion in brief. Hey, Eric, this is the way that I see things. And then just walk away and let me process so that I can come to a point of wisdom, if I can call it that, rather than you just imparting me your wisdom, which only becomes my knowledge.
I've been reading this book. I may have mentioned in a previous conversation with you, called Brain Chains. The author is Theo Compernoll, and I think he's a neuropsychologist. The book aims to help us understand that distractions are not good, right? That such things as multitasking doesn't exist, that our brains are designed in a certain way where there's a need for things that are repetitive, that your brain already gets, sort of our primitive thing, right? We drive, we don't think about pushing the gas and the brake when all those things with practice come together. But that there's a part of the brain that needs singularity of thinking, and it's the one that takes the most energy, sort of our conscience, right? And he states, and actually I think science to this point states that we can only think about one conscious thing at a time, which means, going back to listening, when you are with someone else, creations, things that come from a discussion, can only happen if you are willing at that very moment to do the one thing, it's just listen. So you're consciously listening rather than arguing with the other person that your point is better than theirs. Is at that time that innovation happens, right? Is when you are willing to not only give out what you think, your idea, your opinion, but also willing to listen to the other person's idea or opinion, hopefully creating a new one, right? One that takes elements from that idea and elements from the other idea and create, again, you hear the theme of bridging. It just doesn't go away. It's, to me, is the possibilities, right? The possibilities are incredible if you just allow for those two things to come together and then sprout a brand new idea, which is even better. At that time, yeah, you individually, you can go away and experiment on your own on what that idea may become. But at the time, you dedicated that one time, that extremely high energy moment, to listen, if you're listening, but also to then allow for that creation. And then that other part of the brain, which is the librarian, archiving, connecting part of the brain, then takes time when you're not thinking and when you're maybe sleeping to connect all the dots, make the weird connections, so that the next time you are in your conscious part, you bring that out, right? And now it makes a lot of sense. It's a fascinating book, by the way. It's incredible. It's Brain Chains, and that's what it refers to. It's the things that basically take you away. The brain chains are things that take you away from those moments where you allow your conscious self to truly make those discoveries. You basically chain them back there, most of which has to do with, I think he called it ICT, which I believe is something along the lines of individual connectivity tools or something like that. That's what he calls them, which are your phone and, answering emails, or that desire to do things right away as opposed to focusing. But going back to the point you were making, yes, absolutely. And in culture, the same thing, right? Is an opportunity for someone to see something that eventually becomes the norm. But it was somebody's idea at some point. And yes, I think we all in some way learn best when we experience it ourselves than when someone else does. My personal position on that is that the smartest people learn as much from that as they do from somebody else's mistakes. You don't want to repeat people's mistakes, right? If you are, then it makes me think perhaps you're not observing close enough. It's not the same as trying, and it's just, if you are going to try something truly different, not just the same thing and falling the same mistake.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And hopefully that last point actually lets us come around to, you've come to the point where you are a manager, a leader. You mentioned CliftonStrengths and all that, but I want to say something real quick about, one, I will have links, so brain chains and other things. I'll have that in the show notes in case anyone is interested. But also for anyone that's listening, Carlos, you were saying about, within this book, the argument is you can really only focus on one thing at a time. And an exercise that I'll have people go through in presentations sometimes, I'll ask people to stare at one spot, something that's fairly simple, like look at a spot on the carpet in front of you or a spot on the wall, whatever you're looking at, make it fairly basic and keep your focus in that one spot. But then take your mind and take in the things that are around that spot. So let's imagine that you're staring at the wall and the curtains for your window are just off to the left. You can see them, but you keep your eyes in one spot. The further out you go from the center of your focus, the less and less detail you get about the thing that you are aware of. It's there. But unless you turn your eyes to that spot, you can only take in so much about that object. And I use this example often because I think it makes a lot more obvious what the landscape of your consciousness is like when you're watching TV and your phone buzzes and your child's also talking to you from 15 feet behind you, and all this stuff is going on. And to some extent, you take it all in, or you flip back and forth so quickly that you don't experience that you're just kind of mentally looking at one thing, then the other thing, then the other thing, then the, back and forth. You can, to some extent, consciously take it all in. But the further you get from the center of your mental focus, the less information you get.
Yeah, it's very good. And one of the points that made in the book, it's talking about specifically texting or being on the phone while driving, is that physically your eyes, that part that focuses on something, is very tiny. It's sort of a matter of millimeters. And that you have that peripheral view, which is not that focus. It's blurry. Just exactly what you're describing, right? So in order for you to remain with your eyes on the road, you truly have to keep your eyes on the road. So every time that you look at your GPS or someone is calling and you want to know who's calling, or you drop your eyes to touch something, second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, you know that it's there. You think, you can see what is coming from the side, but really what your brain is telling you, there is something coming from the side, but you can't tell what that something is unless you move your eye and focus on that. It's exactly what you're talking about, right? And so we do a disservice. And I think we are all in some sort of stage in our journey on whether or not we have come to the realization that being present is almost akin to being focused. So if you're talking to your child, be present, right? Be listening only to that. Forget about the buzzing of your phone. or something else. Can you really do that? It's the hardest thing to do, right? I mean, we have so many inputs all the time. Sensory, physical, I mean, it's just ridiculous. But the point you're making is essentially that, right? Is if you do not allow or consciously allow for your brain to block the fuzz that is around you, you will miss. And that's what he calls intellectual productivity, right? So your intellectual productivity comes down drastically because now you have this moment where you took away your focus from whatever context you were into a new context. That's where it's actually worse. To then try to come back to the previous one, which is most likely, it'll take you minutes, if not 10 to 15 minutes, just to get back to the same level where you were, just trying to reconnect the things. So if you actually think of it that way, it makes a lot more sense to say, you know what, for this time, I'm putting my phone away on silence, whatever, and I'm just going to focus. You do that, and then you become more sequential on your doing rather than parallel, which he argues is not very productive, regardless of how good of a multitasker you think you are. The science doesn't support it. It's not true. Anyways, fascinating thing. We can go down that hole for a while and maybe never come out, but we'll see. Bottom line is, if you want to build the right kind of bridges, if you want to tell someone the right kind of thing so they actually steer towards greatness or excellence, you need to be paying attention. And the only way to pay attention is if you are noticing. And that's where I think we are all a little different. What will attract you about someone or something that someone said or something that someone did will be different than mine. And that's perfectly fine. We will call out different greatness about other people. But the key isn't noticing it, is about hopefully building the bridge by telling that person at that very time with as much detail as possible how they made you feel. Right? That's data. Nobody can tell you that you were not feeling that way. You can tell them at that precise moment how they made you feel and what exactly was that they were doing. And they can choose at that point. I'm going to repeat that. That felt good to me too. I'm going to do it again. And the next time you do it better and better and better and better. And that leads to excellence, right? Which is, talking as a maximizer, that's really what I love to see. People really firing at full power, right? With all the gifts that they have, that they were given through genetics, or if you have, I believe, about a higher entity, that it was given that way. It doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, you are asked to do the best that you can do with the things and the tools that you were given.
For everyone listening, Carlos mentioned maximizer. So we're going to come around to CliftonStrengths here in a second. But there was a point in your education and your career where you decided, I guess, if I can put it this way, that you weren't so interested in being an individual contributor. I suspect that affected your career choices. You also probably had some just innate characteristics, behavioral traits, whatever, that over time, one step after another led you towards being a manager, so to speak. So real quick, can you describe what your company does, what you do day to day, whether, and you could talk about your particular facility or the company more specifically. And then when we come around to you being a manager, I would love to explore CliftonStrengths and how that plays into your interactions with people that you manage.
So earlier I mentioned that I have worked for the same part of the company for a very long time, since 2000. At the time, I was hiring to a manufacturing facility that manufactures DNA, synthetic nucleic acids. So hopefully a lot of people that listen to this know at least that we all have DNA ourselves. And in order to study the sequence or how it all interacts and moves and does what it needs to do, there are some tools that are necessary. A long time ago, somebody got a Nobel Prize for discovering, or at least advancing, what is called today the polymerase chain reaction, PCR. And that has become essentially a tool, the biggest tool, for the identification, right, of areas in what we call the genome, that is the sum of our DNA. And that basically sprung this industry where I got my first job, which was a chemical way, synthetic way, to create little portions of that so-called genome, using that tool called PCR, for example, to amplify a region of the genome that you wanted to study more. So there's just one way. These days, of course, has become a lot more complex. There's such things as real-time PCR. There's such a thing called RT-PCR, which stands for reverse transcriptase, real-time PCR. And all of these tools allow us today to do things such as diagnosis. So there are certain illnesses and diseases that have a root in genetics, and those can be studied. So what we do is we create or manufacture those pieces of synthetic DNA to enable our customers to actually do those or help in those discoveries. Many of the things that today people are familiar with, for example, during COVID, people would get tested and they have a very quick test. You remember an antigen test you can do over the counter, run it through a laminar flow, a membrane, and you will see whether or not you had it or not. Or in some instances, you had to send your sample away for hours or days for someone to run a PCR with these tools, like the ones we make, to basically tell you, yes, you have it, right? One is more sensitive than the other. So we enable our customers to basically make those discoveries. We like to say that we spark discoveries, right, that hopefully elevate humanity. That's kind of our vision as a company. So the company I work for, I mentioned locally, we were born in 1984, 88, out of Baylor College of Medicine. And at the time, it was called Genesis Biotechnologies. And that became Sigma Genesis when Sigma Aldrich bought us in 1998. And eventually evolved into a name that's today. We're just part of MilliporeSigma, which is part of Merck KGaA of Darmstadt, Germany. This massive company is about 62,000 employees strong, is based out of Germany, and it has three major business: electronics, so basically anything that you see for your phone or even microchips and the likes. We provide, again, materials for that industry. We have healthcare. We have a healthcare part of it. And we also have the life sciences, which is where I am a part of. So my site, the site that I have the privilege of leading, is here in Texas, just north of Houston, in a little township called the Woodlands. And we, again, provide that kind of tools, where the rest of the company, life science, provides the rest of the tools, enzymes and reagents and weird chemicals. And for those of you who have been in science for a very long time, the old Sigma Aldrich catalog, the Sigma Red, big thing, and the Aldrich catalogs are part of my history as well. Ultimately, the way we're making a difference is simply by making those little creatures. We make hundreds of thousands of unique ones. That's also another piece that is super attractive about what I do, is that everything that we make to order. So customer orders on one day, and within 24 hours, we have to produce, a large amount of them, say 60 to 70% of our products basically are made to order within 24 to 48 hours. That is just cranking out very quickly. What was unique about it links back to what I was saying before. I love what is unique about people. And I think this business, which I have called home for a very long time, by its very nature, is unique. We make unique things for unique people, for unique scientists out there. And though that's not personality, it's just simply yet another version of that desire to be surrounded by the unique. And that's something that. So I think that sums up sort of where we came from, how we ended up where we are today, the kinds of tools that we make, how many of those we do, how unique that is, and how we're hopefully making a dent in the world with the products we make, which again goes eventually, hopefully, back to my particular leadership, how I lead this group, how I have evolved over the years as a result, thanks to the availability of tools like CliftonStrengths.
So you said that your wife introduced you to CliftonStrengths in 2014, and you did the assessment, you had some level of experience with it over time. Eventually you became certified. So walk me through a little bit of that, and then how it plays into your management and maybe beyond that. It could be parenting. It could be how you interact with your people that are leading other facilities in your business. But where did that start, CliftonStrengths? What was your experience? How did it evolve? And then how does it play in today?
That is exactly how it started. So my wife, who works for a large company of her own, we're just finished with taking the assessment as oftentimes, which is the case, as the new thing, right? Hey, somebody told them this is a great thing to do, and here's the tool. She came back with the book. At the time, it was still a book with a little thing inside. And I bought my version, and I got it. And interestingly, two interesting things. Number one is when we compared our results, we were very similar in terms of themes, yet we were so keenly aware of our differences and how we see the world and how we approach the world, which is something I love about CliftonStrengths, which is it's far more about how we are different and how we are the same. And not saying just there, right? Is calling those differences a gift to be leveraged, right? Going back to the question the discussion we had before, when you go out on a walk with someone else and you are open to what they have to say, how they see the world, new things come, right? And that's what I love about it. That's why I think it's a great complement to a lot of the other tools that exist that, in my opinion, are far more about. There's a lot about how we are the same and how we can work together from the sameness perspective, where CliftonStrengths, I think, is how do we work together from a differences perspective, right? Which attracts me most. So it wasn't very long after I took the assessment that I went to my then manager and I said, listen, I think this is a great thing to do. I would love for the company to sponsor me. And taking this, the certification process is about a 5-day, at least at the time, it was 5 days up in Nebraska, where Gallup is headquartered, with a lot of other folks wanting to do exactly the same. Like Gallup had at that point, maybe a few years before that, decided that they wanted to go big and train as many coaches as possible, so that they would go out and tell others about CliftonStrengths and continue to change the world. That was their aspiration, and still is, to change the world by helping people see what they most likely do great, and let that change the world in itself. I'm happy to say that I'm part of that process. So I tried to convince my manager that, hey, this is something the company should invest on, not because it would allow me to go out and be coach, but actually because it would allow me to coach within. I had not made fully the connection between my path in leadership and coaching. And I think ultimately I call that my leader coaching journey, right? So that was sort of where I was coming from on that one. Later on, Gallup published a book called It Is the Manager. And it's essentially a little textbook that basically the message is we are called as managers or leaders to serve in a different way than it was before. Instead of a boss, you're now a coach, right? That's what people are looking for. So I don't know if I would say that I was ahead of my time, but I was just thinking, how can I use this to be better at what I do? And it worked out. I still praise this manager for seeing that, and he has continues to work for the company, and he's done incredible things. He's a great leader, taking on yet far more challenges than I have in his own way, and I could see his aspirations, right? But he gave me the chance, and say 10 plus years later, here we are talking about it, and hopefully using it as a way of managing better, of being a better leader, to coach people rather than to direct people. And that's, I think, in many ways, sort of how that has evolved for me at work, right? In how I have incorporated that knowledge, that experience, that certification into how I lead every day.
Is there a philosophy, I guess, behind CliftonStrengths that is we can better understand ourselves, or we can better lead if we, at a minimum, understand a person's strengths, and then maybe on top of that, if we work to accentuate those strengths, or if we try and position people to use those strengths, as opposed to another philosophy, and I don't know what that one would be, but something that is perhaps more concerned with someone's weaknesses.
So yes, in fact, a lot of what CliftonStrengths is based on is this principle, right? Kind of brought up by Dr. Donald Clifton, of what would happen if people would focus on what is right with people rather than what is wrong with people. That's essentially what was at the base of all of his research and work. CliftonStrengths, then StrengthsFinder, really came together as a result of a lot of interviews. And this is what I find unique. It was a lot of interviews of people of all ways of life, CEOs to people in janitorial services, to doctors, to teachers, focus on those that were most successful. So a lot of the questions was, how do you succeed? And ultimately, that's where it led to the tool. The tool, kind of deceiving, called StrengthsFinder, did not tell you precisely what your strengths were, but rather it gave people language that they could use to truly discover what their strengths were. Right? As a result of the assessment, people would get information about how they most naturally got things done, or build relationships, or influence others, or think about the future. And then people, the expectation was that people would take that information and then invest with intention on developing those findings. And so that's where, again, Gallup's definitions of talent and strength come in. So a talent is a pattern of thinking, feeling, or behaving that can be productively applied. And that's a big part of it. Productively applied, right? You can all have feelings, but they'll take you in the wrong direction. Well, that maybe not it, right? Then a strength is the product of taking talent and adding skill and experiences to produce what they define as a strength, which is the ability we all have to perform a given task to near perfection every time we do it. Later on, through reading and familiarizing myself with a gentleman named Marcus Buckingham, I also added to that particular definition of a strength in saying, and it also must energize you, because we sometimes are good at something, but in a particular context, it may not excite us as much, even though we're good at it. My best example, as easiest one, is for someone in human resources. There may be this person who loves and gets a kick out of diving into thousands of resumes, looking for the top 5 resumes. But don't ask them to then tell you which of those 5 are the best. They just love the intensity, the curiosity that comes from reviewing this many. But then if you put them in a position where all they do every day is just look at those 5, they may not be as energized, even though they may be good at it. But there may be someone in human resources with similar themes, which actually finds it far more exciting to work on those 5 and just get the one, right? And would find it absolutely mind-numbing to go through thousands of resumes.
There are how many strengths?
34.
Or 34. Okay. And if I'm hearing you correctly, if I do Strengths Finder, now CliftonStrengths, right, which I have, and I'm sure we'll get to that. This is not an assessment that's going to tell me what type of career I should have, as much as should you choose to go into a trade, should you choose to go into some type of office work, you are more likely to perform at top level, to be energized by these types of tasks or work within that chosen field.
I think so. And again, it's very complicated, right? It's far more complicated, perhaps, that we could discuss here today. So, number one, yes, this is not a career definition or picking tool. That is by far not it. It's really about the persona. It's about you. And it's about the principle that the more you know about yourself, the easier it will be for you to land in a place where you can put all of that and more to work on a consistent basis, right? Ultimately, what you want is a place where you, on an everyday basis, can probably tell to yourself, every time I come to work, I have an opportunity to use or to do what I do best, right? That's what you want to be. At least the opportunity. Doesn't mean that you're going to get to do 100% of everything that you like to do. That would be nearly impossible. But if you can almost always basically say, every time I come here, I get a chance to do what I do best. I have the opportunity to do so. Not only is your manager doing a good job, right, by creating such an environment, but you potentially are in a role where you get to fire up most all the time, right? Did you get to reframe your world and talk about your world and think about your task through the same lens every time or very often? And so going back to that question originally, is that CliftonStrengths focuses on what you do best as a means to produce excellent results consistently. Whereas they don't say you should not know your weaknesses. In fact, they will go as far as saying you should know them as well as you know your strengths, because you don't want them to bog you down, right? You don't want them to get in the way. So there are going to be some roles where you may not have natural talent. For example, I will share, I mentioned in my top 10, so these 34, we call it themes of talents, but interchangeably people call them strengths and is okay, I think, so long as we're talking about the same thing. But these themes of talents, 34 of them, are ordered once you take the assessment from 1 to 34, from most intense to less intense. The ones at the bottom 5, for example, are things you need to know what is out there, but it's not your focus. But you need to know. For example, my number 34, and again, going back to 2 very peculiar things about me and being in a position to lead others, is number 1 is in my top 10, I don't have any such themes considered to be strategic thinking, right? So if someone has seen that and say, okay, this is my card to whether you will be a leader or not, I probably would have been scratched out, right? What? No strategic thinking? You can't be a leader. Wrong, right? We can all lead. We just lead in different ways. On the other end, and this is something that has been very big in this day and age, is my number 34 is a thing called empathy. And what is it that we're told 1,000 times a day about great leaders or great managers? That they need to practice empathy, that we need to be empathetic. How in the world would a person that has empathy number 34 succeed at being empathetic in some way? Well, there is a thing as being empathetic and learning skills to, right? Listen carefully, to be present. We talked about that earlier. And there is this thing called leading with empathy. Two different things, right? Two different things. If I have empathy number 1, right, I am the kind of leader that has this sixth sense for emotion. You can tell. You can walk somewhere, you can feel it. There is something weird about you that allows you to do that. I don't have that, right? What that means is I can be empathetic at times, but my natural move is towards, as soon as I hear you telling me that you have something bothering you, something that is dragging you down, I will listen for 5 minutes and I will be almost immediately trying to solve your problem, getting you out of that and moving forward. Someone that leads with empathy, they can sit back and listen to you for hours upon hours, days, if not weeks, right? They are just naturally patient with that. They may not agree with you. Empathy is not about agreeing with you. It's just simply being able to see the world through your eyes. And I can see it for about a window of 5 minutes before I want you to be moving towards resolving whatever that is, moving towards excellence. And those are two different things. I can still show empathy, but I will not be as excellent as someone who leads with empathy from the CliftonStrengths perspective, right? Just again, it's not a dictionary definition of these words. I don't. If you actually taken the assessment and you were to look at the definitions, you will see that it's not an Oxford Dictionary definition, right? It's far more than just that. So going just to close this, yes, CliftonStrengths and the philosophy behind it is let's focus on what comes more naturally to us and helps us be successful, to essentially make your weaknesses irrelevant, even if they exist, right? You will be far more successful and certainly faster if you focus on what you are strong at rather than what you're weak at.
Let's just say that somebody's listening to this, they apply for a job, and jobs have personality assessments, skills assessments, whatever. Let's just make up a scenario in which you have taken this assessment, and you've done CliftonStrengths, and someone looks at your results without having talked to you or had some experience with you. It sounds to me like they can understand you at a certain level because they read your top 5, your bottom 5, whatever it is. But there is another aspect to you that is not shown here, So I appreciate the example that you give of, it's not that you are not empathetic. It's that in certain cases you might describe it as being, it's not natural. It doesn't give you energy. That's not the place that you start from or whatever else, but it's not that you're incapable of doing that. And my guess would be that there are plenty of people who walk into CliftonStrengths, they experience it for the first time and perhaps misunderstand that. They think that this is a pure encapsulation of what you're good at and what you're bad at.
I would say that it is true, and why Gallup has chosen to train as many coaches as possible. They will also almost always say everybody needs a coach, right? And when I do run into someone and offer either to share with them a key for them to take the assessment, I never just simply share the key. I like to have a follow-up conversation. And again, I don't coach for, at this point, I don't coach for profit. I use it within work, and that's where most of my connections within CliftonStrengths are. I absolutely want to follow up because again, we are trained that way. I think the way we are trained is to try to fix what is broken. And most performance reviews and performance development is essentially that saying, right? Is what is the gap? What is broken? Let's go fix it. And that's where you spend most of your time, as opposed to, okay, so then is it getting in the way, right? If it is getting in the way, let's say, for example, you are in a marketing job and you hate communicating, we would have to have a conversation, right? Because ultimately, what is marketing if it isn't about communicating the value of a product or making connections with a group of people that eventually will buy your products? And in that way, though, right, you may find from taking the assessment that the things that come more natural to you may be best used if you were in a role, maybe still within marketing. There are different, I'm sure, I mean, you are in the marketing world, that there are different layers of marketing, right? Some people are in this part and some people are in that part. Some people do the research, whereas some people actually translate the research into something, into insight. And this person may love marketing just because of the research and not necessarily because of how it is presented out into the world, whereas the other one does. Now, that one that is more fascinated with telling the world something may lead with communication talents, right? Or maybe a bit more out there, may love the stage, may love to connect value with other pieces. Whereas the other is far more about everything that makes up that desire, right? The research behind it. And there needs to be a bridge. I go back to my bridge. There is the bridge between the people that go out and seek the details and the research and hopefully start to see the connections, and that person that then takes that information and further translates it into something that is digestible by the audience they're trying to reach. So what I see fascinating about all of these is that once you deep dive into these things, my wife actually gives me a hard time with this, and my kids as well, is that I almost seem like always talking to you and listening to analyze you. And I really don't do that. My goal is not to analyze you. I'm not a therapist. My goal is to find and hopefully articulate in an intelligent way, what is it that I heard that you can then use and repeat? That's my ultimate goal. Is I would love to eventually help you see how X behavior or thing you did is something that will repeat and that you should indeed repeat and invest on so that you can be even more successful.
Is this where it plays most obviously into your role as a manager?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think that is the prime place for using this. I joke. I'm not sure that I would ever be able to go solo as a coach, because I think personally, I don't like the process of marketing, like actually thinking about it, what I need to do to market myself. I would love somewhere where all I need to do is do, and people know, and then they just simply call me. That would be wonderful. But within my context, I have plenty of clients. I don't have to go and seek them. They are the people that I deal with every day, and I get a chance to have a captive audience, right? It's an audience that wants to succeed, to perform, that are linked to the same goals, and my job is to help them see how they uniquely contribute to that. And CliftonStrengths is just a tool. It's about uniqueness, right? It's about those differences that make us great, that we should leverage the heck out of them with positive intent. The thing Gallup, and this applies to pretty much every tool, I think, in many ways. but they sort of preach these 5 principles. One principle is these themes or these results is one words are neutral. They're not positive. They're not negative. You can make them positive or negative, right? We know plenty of leaders that are leaders because they have followers, but whose values and principles are questionable, right? Of whether or not they're positive or not, right? Well, we have plenty in history. They're not labels. That's number 2, right? You should not go around and say, oh, that's your self-assurance, for example, that's you getting in the way of, and you just basically start stamping labels. You're extrovert, you're introvert, whatever. It's far more than that, right? We are complicated creatures, very complex, to be reduced to a single word label, right? Whether that is a theme or a personality trait or the color of your skin or your culture, whatever, is a disservice. Number 3 is use positive intent, right? This knowledge about someone, going back to what you were saying, if I had shared with you my results and you share with me your results, that information should be used with positive intent. It should just be used to enrich our conversations, to ask better questions, to poke for and be curious about what that means, and then ultimately produce something better, right? Again, going back to that addition, 1 + 1 here is not equal to 2, it's more. The 4th is differences are a gift. They're not things to divide. They're not things to push apart. They are things to be leveraged. And then goes back to this. And the final one, which caps very well, is we all need each other, right? Talent develops in the context of others. And that's where observation comes in. If you see something, say something. And say it as soon as you see it, with as much color as you can, so that person can digest that and then use it and get better and better and better, to the point that whatever their weaknesses were become completely irrelevant, right? Kind of like Messi with his left-footishness, right? Nobody would have hired him because he only can do it with one side, not like Ronaldo. And yet, well, history tells a different thing, right? He made it such a weapon that his right leg became irrelevant. I mean, it didn't matter. And I think that that's sort of the journey we are on, right? Is make your strengths so obvious, such an obvious part of your success that your weaknesses become irrelevant.
Before we come around to wrap this up, I want to keep going a little bit on, for your experience as a manager, where this plays in, how it helps, by asking, if I recall correctly, there's a person on your team or who works with you that has either gotten certified or has gone fairly deep on the GROW model, which is something that I have a lot of experience in. And for anyone that's not familiar with that, GROW falls within the performance coaching camp, but it's really just a tool to facilitate focus in a person. And GROW stands for goal, reality, options, and way forward, or willingness. So it has its place, largely focused around helping someone focus on what is your goal and then what are you going to do to get it done. We don't have to explore GROW, but I'm curious, you have this person who has gone fairly deep on GROW. Maybe you have other people that have been interested in other things, or you've seen SPACE or a Berkman assessment or Myers-Briggs or whatever else. And so where have you, in your experience as a manager, as a leader, seen a need for other skill sets or other tools? Or if you haven't, how often and when does something like CliftonStrengths play into your leadership or your mentorship of people you work with?
At Merck, if there's something that they have, is just plenty of tools, right? They've taken the approach of providing a sea of tools. Amongst the tools is something called insights discoveries. I'm not sure you're familiar. It's kind of similar to the personality traits. It's based on that. those same principles, right? CliftonStrengths, interestingly, is not one of the tools. It's one that I have covertly been trying to push because I do think that it complements those. So I can speak for what we have done, and just recently we embarked on what we duped a supervisor academy. We realized that we were bringing people into supervisory roles, so people leaders, without really formally equipping them for being so and how to do this best, and kind of align expectations for the role with what they naturally brought to the role versus how to connect all of those for ultimate excellence and performance. And so part of it was we said, listen, our Insights Discoveries is the tool that the company as a whole has promoted for many years. So we're not going to step away from that because I do think that they provide information about yourself that is very valuable, more along the lines of personality traits. CliftonStrengths, though, it falls under that psychometric type of assessment. I don't know that I would call it a personality trait assessment. I think I call it let's find out how do you most naturally succeed assessment. And it focuses on something different, which to me is another layer of granularity on your journey to understand you or yourself. How else can you lead? And going back to how do you lead? How else can you lead effectively if you don't know yourself first? I mean, it's ludicrous to actually think that you could, because then you will be potentially trying to emulate or lead like others as opposed to focusing on leading the way you most naturally do. And I think that that's sort of where these things connect when it comes to leadership and my own personal journey on leadership. So personally, as a leader, or the way I lead, I mentioned earlier something that when I was going through my personal coaching, so I was, working with someone as an executive coach, someone that was coaching me. And what we set as our goal was how to become a better leader coach. That's what I really called it at the time. And it was with this in mind, right? That there's common ground. And I realized that my role, yes, as the site director for this manufacturing location, is to set direction, but I also have this manager role, which is a title I have, and I have a certain authority. Whereas to lead, you don't need a title, right? I mean, you've heard that before, right? You don't need a title in order to lead. You need followers, and followership is a psychological decision by the person who decides to follow you. And they do so if they align with your values, with what you're preaching, with the way you do so. But you don't need a title for that. These days, again, going back to me, what I believe these tools do is just simply making you more aware of what comes more natural to you, so that being aware of that, you know where your triggers are. You know when you're going to go in a not very productive direction and where you would, right? What things interest you more and what don't, which then leads to effective collaborations, right? And then you find someone that does that naturally well, and you pair up, right? And then you produce something even better. So for some things you can go solo, although most of us, it's kind of hard to just be solo. And in other cases, you pair up with someone that otherwise would just enjoy doing what you don't and what doesn't bring you energy at all. And that's sort of my principle. I tell people, I walk around with a little chart that has every single person at the site. I can do that because we have less than 100 people. I wouldn't recommend this for someone who has 5,000 people in their campus and you're the leader there. You walk with a little book and you're basically going through every individual. But I have the chance to actually have in a single page every single name with their top 5 at the very least. If they have more, I can see that as well. And I don't use it just as a way to simply manage my conversations, although it will influence me. But more to, as a leader, is to find when there is an opportunity. And I think that someone has certain things that could make this a very interesting, exciting opportunity. Knowing their contacts and their journey, to basically say, listen, I know you love, for example, I know you love to do research and look into and find tools, for example, as someone with input may like, right? And I have this project we're about to go into. We just need people to look into, to spend time doing that. Would you be interested? And all of a sudden you click on something. This person may be a technician, just moving product. And then all of a sudden they have this additional deviation from it that inspires that curiosity. And now they're growing, right? Now they're growing, they're expanding. They're not just moving product from left to right or from right to left. They're also kind of exercising that other part, which just comes natural to them. And that, I think, is one of the ways where I feel I bring my unique way of leading, right? Is connecting with the individuals at that level first. And then through that, setting them up in a learning journey, right? That they cannot resist because it just speaks to them. And that makes my role as a leader that much easier. That means, right, that then I have people that are constantly looking for those themselves, because they know themselves. And I focus on yet other ways of having an impact, which this year has been an amazing one for me, because this whole thing, I told you, this covert way of bringing in CliftonStrengths has picked up. People want to know how they can lead best. And I have had 5-6 of these workshops with leaders within the company from around the world, essentially bringing them together by knowing what the CliftonStrengths are, how they can work together as a team, and how they can then spring that and launch it on their daily basis. So I think that's ultimately what I feel, and how I feel CliftonStrengths has changed me, is being unapologetically me in a very productive way. Spend lots of time adding more knowledge and skill to those things that come more natural to me, so that the things that are at the bottom, like empathy, which, by the way, if you ask anybody that has met me or worked with me, they would probably disagree that I am not an empathetic person. We all have the capability of being empathetic, right? We can. It's just that we use different channels to do so. In my case, I think I use my individualization and my relator, which are things that basically speak about the personal relationship and that desire to know something special about you, as a means of knowing your story. And once I know that story, I link. And once I bridge with you at that level, then performance is easy. Then I can talk about performance all the time. And they are open. People are open to listen to what I may suggest, or the questions I may ask, or even my advice, if that comes to that point, like in a mentorship relationship, which I have a few of those as well, which, again, I know they're sorts of joy for me, which is now that people think I have something they can benefit from, they're asking for it. It sort of feels my significance world. That's my number 7 attention, where you are in a position to make a difference, and you know it because people are asking you for it, but not allowing that to get over your head, and just remain humble. Know that people are asking you because you have something that they think is valuable, but that doesn't make you someone above themselves, right? You got to stay there. Otherwise, then it defeats the purpose. I don't know if all of that actually came together, but I think ultimately that's what I thought you may have asked.
You made a statement about facilitating a person getting into a place where they can really play, if I recall correctly. And then also, I think you were saying it there, good and bad things, if I can call it that, if you want to read it as good and bad, but you can also read it as neutral. This is a description of an aspect of the person. And it can be good, it can be bad. But there's a good portion of good or bad that really kind of depends on how you choose to read it. And you may read something as bad that could be an asset in your life, in your
Oh,
experience.
yes.
Now, I wish that we had more time, but I know that we have to wrap up. I think that there's probably another discussion that we could have about the importance of getting people into positions where they can, at least as I put it, play.
Hey, everyone. I have to jump in here, unfortunately, because while you could likely tell that Carlos and I were getting close to wrapping up, we unfortunately got disconnected right at the end of our recording. Thankfully, Carlos agreed that I could go ahead and wrap this up and share where you can find him. The best place to find and connect with Carlos is on LinkedIn. I've placed a link to his LinkedIn profile in the show notes. Please do go and check him out and send him a message or connection request, follow him, and so on. And while I've already said this to him directly, I want everyone that's listening to this to hear and also have it be out there with the recording. Thank you, Carlos, for recording with me. As I hope you know, I've enjoyed every conversation that we've had. We clearly have some shared interests, and so I appreciate you being here. I also hope that we will speak again, not just on the podcast, but also personally. So once again, thank you, Carlos, and thank you, everyone, for listening to this.